And the questions I ask are, does size affect small state diplomacy in a fundamental way? Are small states full partners in the international community? Is their diplomacy a relevant factor in setting the long-term trend of global diplomacy? Or is it mainly a diplomacy restricted to those limited and practical issues that are of immediate and internal concern? I see today's diplomacy as navigating within a continuum of choices, ranging from the discretionary exercise of power to a strict adherence to the collective application of the rule of international law. And it is within this framework that I see the effect of small states as operating within the multilateral system and creating a marked bias in favor of consensus and of the rule of law. They do so out of a deep-rooted and quite logical conviction that therein lies the best long-term guarantees of their own security and autonomy. In turn, this leads to the emergence of solidarity among smaller states as a way of counteracting the presumed freedom of maneuver by the larger and more powerful members. It puts a premium on the notions of legitimacy, to which all states, large or small, powerful or weak, attach importance, if only for internal reasons. What is a small state? One can take a quantitative approach to the subject. I prefer taking a qualitative approach. Quantitative definitions use the criteria of absolute size, based on demographic, geographical, or economic factors, singly or in combination. This type of definition seeks to focus attention on the weaknesses and vulnerabilities, which in one form or another are the byproduct of smallness: insufficient resource endowment, unsustainable market base, inadequate security capability, exposure to environment hazards, and so on. Such considerations tend to circumscribe the diplomacy of small states as primarily directed to those tasks that somehow cushion or avoid these weaknesses and vulnerabilities. They have little to say about the role that small state diplomacy can play in giving shape and direction to the political order of which all states, whatever their size, are members. The qualitative approach to smallness concentrates on relationships and the perceptions that define those relationships. A basic premise of the qualitative approach is that in most cases, relationships are among unequals. Size plays a part in these relationships, but only in relative terms, and is never the only or even the main consideration. Under this approach, one useful template for a study of diplomacy may be built around two related dualities. In both the bilateral and the multilateral contexts, diplomacy can be seen as operating on two levels: the specific and the normative. It is in the various linkages that operate within this template that small state diplomacy can come into its own. It does this in particular through the emphasis it attaches to the normative work of diplomacy, especially at the multilateral level. One can look at how these ideas find reflection in the experience arising from the fourth round of the EU accession negotiations, which concluded with the admission of 12 new members, 10 in 2004 and 2 this year. With the exception of Poland and Romania, all these 12 candidates were countries with a population of 10 million or under. At the same time, it should be remembered that on the other side of the negotiating divide, 9 of the 15 EU member countries also had populations of 10 million or less. The European Union has two fundamental characteristics which are of interest and relevance to small states. The constrained role which size and power relations play in its internal dynamics, and an institutional structure that reconciles in a novel and effective way the intrusiveness of an ever-widening functional cooperation with a strong and persisting sense of national identity and sovereignty. The cooperative and non-competitive spirit in which the accession negotiations were conducted provides a concrete manifestation of the way in which the European Union functions. In a broader sense, this can also be seen as forming part of the trend in international relations to which I referred earlier, and especially the bias in favor of diplomacy based on consensus, norm setting, and the collective application of the rule of international law in preference to one based on a discretionary exercise of power. For the last few decades, this bias has constituted a recognizable and growing force in favor of multilateralism and the spirit of interdependence at both regional and global levels. And it is the small states that have been its strongest proponents. Looking at the global situation today, one may, however, well ask if this spirit of multilateralism and interdependence can hold its own in the international relations of the future. And to what extent can small state diplomacy continue to be a formative factor in this regard? Multilateralism has suffered some severe shocks in the post-Cold War period. There are today strong pressures for it to tilt back towards the latter. It is possible that in these circumstances, small state diplomacy will therefore face greater challenges in the future than it has done in the recent past in maintaining its role in the shaping of international politics. The manner in which small states meet this challenge depends to a large extent on how much they will be able to continue to operate freely in the global and regional institutions as they have been doing in recent years. At the global level, the challenge comes from the nature of the United Nations institution itself. The United Nations Charter has a visible dimension of realpolitik attached to its principles based on equal sovereignty of states. This is most prominent in the unequal allocation of power within the Security Council. There is furthermore the lopsided allocation of authority between the Security Council, with its enforcement powers, and the other major organs, the General Assembly and ECOSOC, where authority is of the softer normative kind. The tensions within the UN between the normative and the consensus-building role of the General Assembly and the authoritative domain of the Security Council has never been fully resolved. The checks and balances in the process depend largely on two elements. One is the interaction among the major powers themselves. It is a question between equals in power. But there is the other element, the role that the smaller states play within the system as a whole. Within the United Nations, the perception does remain that leaving matters to be resolved exclusively as a question between equals in power often carries intolerable risks. The question is whether small states can maintain the moderating role in the process they have gradually established over the years. At the regional level, the interplay between action based on a common approach and action directed by the powerful few is generally more evenly regulated than it is under the UN Charter. This is the case in the various processes taking place in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The European process is by far the more advanced in both its breadth and scope. Here, the forces working towards consensus building remain powerful, though even here, tensions and differences are not absent. I believe that it is at the regional level that the best prospects remain for small state diplomacy to continue playing a formative role in the conduct of international relations. Thank you.